I think I will make a start. So hello and welcome to the latest webinar from Bristol University Press. My name is Philippa Grand and I'm the publisher for international development at the Press. Today I'm delighted that we will be discussing a fascinating new book by Professor Anke Schwittay, Creative Universities, Reimagining Education for Global Challenges and Alternative Futures. Anke teaches anthropology and global development at the University of Sussex in the UK. And in this new book, she explores the role of creative teaching on programmes that focus on social, economic and environmental challenges. In the book, she develops a critical creative pedagogy that combines critical analysis of these challenges with experiential, active and design-informed teaching that develops students' critical thinking, but also their imaginations, emotions and capabilities. This approach to teaching, she argues, is essential in helping students produce solutions to the multiple crises our world is facing. Anke is joined by Craig Hammond, who will be chairing the session for us today. Craig is Senior Lecturer in the School of Education at Liverpool John Moores University in the UK. His research focuses on a variety of areas, including the philosophy of education, utopia and pedagogy and democratic learning. In his recent book, Hope, Utopia and Creativity in Higher Education, he explores the transformative, creative and collaborative potential of education and develops concepts and practices of democratic learning and radical creativity. So just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. Please type any questions that you have in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If you have any technical problems, please use the chats function. We have closed captions enabled on this webinar, and there's the button at the bottom of your screen marked live transcript, and you can use this to show or hide text as you prefer. We will be recording the webinar and it will be available after the event, and details of how to order the book at 50% discount will be posted in the chat shortly too. And please use the code digital50 at the checkout via our website, bristoluniversitypress.com. So that's all for me. Without further ado, I'm now going to hand us over to Craig.
Okay, many thanks for that. So I'd like to welcome everybody, and I'd like to also reiterate kind of thanks and say it's been a pleasure and a privilege to be involved with this, with Anke's book and development of the book kind of since the proposal stage. And it's kind of quite a rare experience because it's such an optimistic and constructive book, which unfortunately the quite rare things, you know, which kind of makes the book stand out even more. So I'm just going to kind of take a few minutes to kind of talk about the book generally and kind of tease out a few points and hopefully not kind of cross over too much on what Anke's going to be saying. But the book itself kind of starts with an invitation. And I'd like to start by inviting everybody to kind of just for a second listen to and consider one of my favorite quotes from the beginning, taken from the beginning of the book. And it's on generative theory. So the quote is, generative theory has an experimental and open stance towards responses to global challenges, an attention to multiplicities and ambiguities. It seeks connections and collaborations and is willing to consider rather than judge. It embraces the unexpected, celebrates surprises, and is interested in building up rather than tearing down. Now, that's a great quote, and I think it wonderfully encapsulates the book as a whole. You know, the book, it does indeed, it is experimental and it seeks out multiplicities, and kind of, I think I'd be hard pushed to think of a comparator book that kind of coherently addresses, to name a few, John Dewey, Kate Raworth and Donut Economics and Brutalism and Tim Ingold and Critical Pedagogy and Complexity and Employability of all things. And of course, creativity. I mean, there's some really great stuff in there, and I'm a massive fan of Tim Ingold's work as well. And the theme of creativity, which of course is important for the book. So Anke's use of and development of creativity is also interesting because it's very democratic and empowering. As she deals with it as an, again, to use another quote, as an everyday creativity, which means that every educator and student has creative capabilities that can be developed and nurtured through pedagogical practices. These must be inclusive and accessible to different learners. And, you know, the book as a whole does so much to offer kind of what I would term as kind of tactics, you know, so it doesn't kind of give blueprints or instructions on how to teach. It's much more useful and kind of, in a sense, more philosophical than that, because it gives us tactics, it gives us ideas and options to try out different approaches to kind of innovative learning. But I think for me, the chapters on design futures and repairing ecologies, I think are particularly good. They're all good, but you know, they're kind of my favorites. Because if we think about it, and of course, as educators, I think we do often think about it, but when we approach teaching spaces, you know, I've been teaching today in what we might term as really quite traditional spaces. But teaching spaces, the environments in which we work and the activities that we get students to participate in, if they are done and kind of churned out in the same ways, they produce the same old types of routinized and often mundane teaching experiences. And I think that for me links into the key point that, which I'm also a big believer in, that we as educators and academics, lecturers, teachers, we also have a responsibility to challenge our own routines. You know, if we want to encourage and facilitate creativity and innovation in students, we have to do that by firstly being creative and innovative ourselves. Which it's never easy to do those things, but thankfully, you know, we now have Anke's book as a mechanism that we can refer to in order to glean, you know, some excellent ideas and kind of new kinds of tactics. I think also I just want to mention that the chapter on ecologies in particular also makes me think of the work associated with the anarchist Murray Bookchin, who's, you know, he's an anarchist, but you know, don't let that put you off. He's a good anarchist, and in particular his stuff on libertarian municipalism, because he kind of encourages us to think of all political environments as places that can be, and indeed should be, actively inhabited and participated in by all people, and I think that's certainly not only one thing, but that's one of the other things that Anke's book does. It's almost a call to arms in a kind of friendly and approachable way. It's a reminder that we need to come together in order to bring about new experiences, new environments, kind of design our teaching materials in different ways, and also kind of encourage students to learn in new and different ways. So to generate the freedom for people to actively participate in and shape educational environments. So as you can probably tell, I am a fan of the book. I think it's great. It's optimistic, it's constructive, it's accessible, and importantly, it's useful. You know, we can take things from it and try, and indeed, going back to the initial kind of opening quote, we can experiment with things, which is something that I would encourage colleagues to do. We kind of, you know, the pace of life in academia and routine can often kind of obstruct us from attempting to try out new and experimental approaches. So yeah, accept Anke's call to arms and start to try out some of the techniques that she kind of writes about in the book. So kind of final comments from me. So we are actually confronted by really quite challenging and dark times. having caught snippets of Boris Johnson's speech today at the the Conservative Party conference in Manchester. So that's all the more reason why we should read books like the one that Anke's produced, because we need optimism. We need ideas for alternative futures. And yeah. So I just want to kind of thank her and congratulate her on writing and publishing the book. So I'm now going to kind of pass over to Anke to speak about it. And then when Anke's finished speaking, I'll kind of facilitate the Q&A session. So just to repeat what Philippa said, if you want to pose any questions while Anke is speaking, please feel free to pose it in the Q&A. But of course, I will kind of receive sort of verbal questions as well towards the end. So over to you, Anke.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Greg, for this really generous and inspiring introduction. And I know you have been a supporter of this book from the very beginning. So thank you to you. And also thank you to Bristol University Press, not just for organizing this launch, but for being such fantastic collaborators in producing this book. It's here, it looks fantastic. And especially Philippa, my editor, who was so excited about this project when I talked to her about the idea for the book about 3 years ago or so now. And I think, Philippa, your enthusiasm for the book from the beginning has been really encouraging for me to write the book and really to kind of, produce it in record time. So thank you to everybody at Bristol University Press for being so fantastic to work with. Now, the book itself is really the result of my 15+ year teaching journey in the fields of anthropology and recently, increasingly, in international development or development studies, global development. There are different names for the field in the US, New Zealand, and now in the UK. Focused research for the book was undertaken over the period of 3 years, mainly in the School of Global Studies, here at the University of Sussex, close to Brighton in the southeast of the UK, where I've been based for the last 6 years, but also at a number of universities in La Paz in Bolivia. Now, all of the places where I've taught over those 15 years have taken a very critical approach to, development, international development, or in general to kind of global North intervention in countries in the global South. And this critical approach really kind of corresponds to my own analysis of development. And this is also mostly appreciated by the students I've been teaching. Now they realize that they come to uni with often quite idealistic or even naive assumptions about, working for the UN and saving the world. And saving the world usually means, helping poor people in faraway countries. And they realize that those assumptions are really problematic, and they realize why it is important to deconstruct these assumptions, to learn about the tensions, the complications, the contradictions within international development. We teach them about colonial legacies. We teach them about kind of neoliberal entanglements and persisting and deepening inequalities. And students are really appreciative of this teaching. But there's also been a consistent second reaction that I've been getting to my own teaching, and I know it's being shared by my colleagues. And that is students saying, okay, I know why it's really important for me to learn this, and why I need to understand that development is much more complicated than I had ever imagined. But now what do I do with this knowledge, right? Where do I go from here? I still want to address global challenges. I still want to be part of bringing about transformative change. But all I'm learning is that development is not working. So this is a reaction of disillusionment, of cynicism, and sometimes kind of hopelessness, and really students, starting to doubt themselves and their ambitions and what brought them to university in the first place. One student said, it's a real paradox. I came here to study development because, I want to be part of change. And now I'm learning that nothing really works. So where does this leave me? Now, as an educator, I thought I have to address these feelings. I cannot ignore them. or I cannot dismiss them. So over the years, I've been thinking, what can I do in my own teaching to address these feelings? And the question for me then was, how can I find a way of teaching that teaches critical skills and analytical thinking, but at the same time that fosters students' imaginations, right? That encourages them to be hopeful, that teaches them to deconstruct, but also to reconstruct, but differently, to find ways, other ways than the ones they are learning, haven't been working in the past. And that's really kind of what the book is all about. So in the book, I developed what I call a critical creative pedagogy. And I think it's a potential way forward to address the impasse that students find themselves at. Now, this has 4 strands: whole person learning, the use of design and arts methods, praxis, and critical hope. And just really quickly, whole person learning really speaks to the obvious fact, and I know Alison James is in the audience, and I borrowed the term from her book actually, that students are, not just brains, they have bodies, they have emotions, they have senses, and all of that they bring in the classroom with them. And as educators, we really need to address them as those whole persons, those individuals. In addition, their experiences are really valuable and important sources of knowledge that we need to bring into our teaching. Design and arts methods for me are really concrete ways in which some of these creative capacities and faculties can be developed. It is about, nurturing and developing imagination. It is about empathy. It is about learning to sit and be comfortable with ambiguity. But then there are also, especially from design, some real useful concepts, the idea of wicked problems. Thinking of global challenges as wicked problems, I think, is a really productive way of, speaking to their complexity and kind of multi-layeredness. The idea of prototyping and really emphasizing the materiality of teaching, all of that for me comes from design and the arts. Now, praxis, that's Paulo Freire, right? His idea of practice informed by theory, by reflection, and by conversations. And that's really about active teaching, about experiential teaching, applied teaching, or project-focused teaching. I usually think of it as learning by doing. I always challenge my students to use their conceptual knowledge and apply it to kind of real-life case studies. And then last, but certainly not least, is this idea of critical hope. And the whole point of critical creative pedagogy is to encourage students to be hopeful in bleak times, we could argue, but it's not a naive hope. It's not an idealistic hope. It's not the hope they came in with, but it's an informed hope. It's a hope that is active, that is reparative, and that is kind of really aware of its own conditions of possibility. So that's critical creative pedagogy in a nutshell. And what I do in the 5 kind of substantive chapters of the book, I show how this pedagogy can inform teaching in the social science disciplines that address global challenges. And my shorthand here is, challenge-focused social sciences, with the aim of helping students to better understand these challenges and to imagine alternative responses to them. And by alternative, I mean non-mainstream, I mean heterodox responses. And I purposely don't really talk about solutions, because I think oftentimes solutions are part of the problem. It is about responses to these challenges. Now, to briefly run through the chapters: remaking academic identities, designing futures, reclaiming economies, repairing ecologies, and prefiguring alternatives. So it is about social, economic, and ecological challenges. And each chapter, chapters are structured quite similarly, and each chapter begins with a brief kind of critical examination of mainstream approaches to these different topics. So for example, in the first chapter on remaking academic identities, I situate my project in the kind of the neoliberal westernized university context in which I was writing, or have been writing, and in which probably most of us are working, and really acknowledging the limitations that come from this context, from this regime under which we are working, but then also, for example, turning to critical pedagogy and to decolonizing the curriculum to start finding alternatives. I write about neoclassical economics teaching. In the chapter on ecologies, I engage with sustainable development and education for sustainable development as kind of the massive mainstream approach to teaching about environmental challenges. And I really kind of draw on the critical literature to show the limitations of that approach. And then, as Greg mentioned, I take on employability, or at least kind of the mainstream ideas of employability that are massive at Sussex and probably at kind of many other universities, and show that there are better and more critical and more transformative ways in which we can prepare students for life after university, because this is really important. And then after this brief kind of critical mainstream introduction, I start looking at various alternatives. And as Greg was saying, I cast my net really widely. And that's on purpose, because I want to provide kind of really accessible entry points to many different alternatives. So they range from degrowth and deep ecology to donut economics. I mentioned decolonization. I talk about Bon Vivir as kind of a Bolivian ecological concept. I talk about prefiguration as a political strategy, complex systems thinking. So it's broad ranging and it's eclectic. The one thing I'm not, and I should acknowledge this, I'm not an education scholar. I wrote this book as an anthropologist who's teaching in international development. So while I know that there's a massive literature out there on teaching kind of philosophies and methods and pedagogies, I'm not engaging with that particular literature. And then I'm going on in each chapter to kind of ask how these alternatives can be taught in critical, creative ways. And I kind of make lots of suggestions. And then each chapter actually finishes with quite a detailed description of 2 teaching activities that either come from my colleagues here at Sussex, and I've had, part of my research was doing lots of interviews, observations in their classes, talking to students, reading their syllabi and teaching material, or experimentations in my own classrooms. And the 2 classes that I've been teaching for a number of years are a specialist module on urban futures to development students and a class on activism to master students. And they've really been great opportunities for me to try out ideas, to get feedback, and to talk to students about this way of teaching. So and I think actually, Greg, it was in one of your early kind of comments on the book proposal. It's a book that aims for pragmatic optimism. I think that was a really good description of what I was trying to do. Having said this, the book is not written as a prescription of methods, right? It's not really a recipe book that's saying, this is what exactly you need to do to achieve this outcome. Instead, it is an invitation for educators to kind of follow my own teaching journey, learn about what I've been doing, what my colleagues have been doing, and then take some of these practices and experiment with them in their own classrooms. That's the sentiment of the book, and that's the way I've been writing it, as an invitation. And I just want to kind of finish this, or a different entry point into this book is to also talk about 2 foundational scholars whose thinking run through the book and who give kind of another idea of what this book is all about. And the first one is actually 2 people, and that's the work of J.K. Gibson Graham. And their writings on becoming academic subjects of possibility. Now, Greg already mentioned in the introduction this idea of generative theory, which I've borrowed and which is actually very, very close to Gibson Graham's idea of weak theory. I just didn't like the word weak. And I think of it as a theory that has the ability to generate alternatives, to generate possibilities. And it was actually discovering one of their kind of early 2008 articles that really kind of gave me the courage to start thinking of this as a kind of a serious academic project. And what they're saying, and what I fully agree with, that in order to be a critical creative pedagogist or researcher or indeed academic, it's important to have a theory that allows possibilities to emerge, right? That encourages experiments, that provides a space for the emergent to germinate and to grow. And we can't do that if we have a theory that kind of from the very outset says, this is never going to work. This is co-opted into capitalism, working in neoliberal universities, these spaces of possibility don't exist. They are immediately kind of co-opted. I obviously don't believe that. I think there is room to maneuver. There are tactics that we can pursue, and by linking up these tactics and linking up with like-minded colleagues, we can bring about change. For me, this is about being a hopeful academic in the sense that Gibson Graham write about, and I found their work incredibly inspiring. And also my chapter on diverse economies is really, on reclaiming economies, is really very much informed by their diverse and community economies project. And the other person here is Arturo Escobar, who is a kind of an anthropologist of development from Colombia. And his writings on the pluriverse, on pluriversal alternatives. He has written a book on the role of design, and in general looked at, over the course of his career, alternatives emerging from Latin America. I'm a Latin Americanist myself. I've been trained in the field. I've been doing research in the region on and off for 25 years. And as I said, I did go to La Paz to talk to colleagues at various Bolivian universities about how they teach development to their own students, because it was really important for me to get a global South perspective on this, not just to decolonize knowledge and expertise, but also to understand the importance of context for teaching. Now, in Escobar himself, he started off, for those of you who might know his work, as a very critical post-development scholar. Indeed, he was kind of part of the emergence of post-development school that is foundational to the critical teaching in international development. But he himself has undertaken a journey and looking much more at possibilities and alternatives. So he's another person whose writings, whose ideas kind of run throughout the book in my own search for possible alternatives. So to conclude then and leave time for questions, I hope there are lots of them. It's not a prescriptive book, as I said, but it's a book that definitely has an agenda. And I'm very honest about my politics and kind of my normative agenda here in arguing for the importance of a critical creative pedagogy that I kind of see as a viable way forward to address some of these challenges and help students imagining alternatives to them. I think we do the critique really well, at least in my fields of teaching. The question is now, how can we do equally well with our creative teaching? And I do believe that the book provides some answers to that. At the same time, it's a very humble agenda. And I'm starting off quite early on with a quote by Sarah Amsler, whose work I also really like, together with Carrie Fraser's work, about it's okay to dream in steps rather than leaps. So there are lots of baby steps in the book, lots of small activities that I describe, non-assessed, short enough to fit into a 50-minute seminar, to activities that could run over a couple of weeks, or some of them could be a whole semester long. Now, having said this, I do also believe that this critical creative pedagogy is very scalable and could be applied to other areas. As I said, I'm a social scientist. I wrote this book with a social science audience in mind, but I'm really looking forward to engaging with educators in other fields, the natural sciences, for example, to talk about how it might look like in their disciplines. So there is a lot of kind of smaller teaching activities, but I actually finished the book with a kind of capstone conclusion, and it's really a set of speculative thought experiments of how universities could be reimagined on a much larger scale. So there's everything from kind of the small to the large, and this critical creative pedagogy is quite scalable, in my opinion. So I will leave it at that. I hope this kind of gives you a brief summary of what the book is all about, why I wrote it, and how I think it can be of interest and of value to you. So I'm really looking forward to your questions and comments.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks. Many thanks for that, Anke. So we do indeed have some questions coming through. So I will start putting those to you in a second. Firstly, if I can kind of take the liberty of my position of hosting, I just want to clarify my rather clumsy term about anarchism. I was just trying to kind of emphasize the fact that Murray Bookchin is a kind of divisive character, or potentially divisive character within the canon of anarchism. But I absolutely love his work, so I just wanted to clarify that. Anyway, on to the questions. So the first question that's come through is from Martin Parker. So Martin asks, what do you think about conventional ideas about engagement, impact, civic, and so on? Are they too co-opted to be radical?
No, not necessarily. As I said, I don't subscribe to an idea where something is automatically co-opted. I think we need to be absolutely honest and quite realistic about kind of the dangers of co-optation, and about how, you know, senior managements use some of these practices and they're turning into buzzwords, and it becomes part of kind of the marketization strategy for universities. I'm really aware of that. Actually, for me, this book actually emerged while I was head of department for 3 years here at Sussex, so I know very well how management works. But I think there's always potential to push back against this, to work against this, and to either appropriate terms and practices, or to come up with our own ones, and to find spaces to maybe present alternative visions. So maybe I'll just briefly come back to this idea of employability, which probably, Martin, could fit very well into kind of your lineup of potentially co-opted practices. And I do believe that kind of mainstream approaches to employability are really quite problematic, because they are not asking students to critically think about the kind of the society in which they are part of and to which they will kind of contribute after university. And I think there are much better ways in which to use things such as placements and internships or work experience programs to connect them to critical reflexivity. And even within the category, and I wouldn't necessarily, you know, call it employability. I talk about work experiences in my book, to do things, or to imagine to do things differently. It's a struggle, I admit that, because, you know, again, when I was head of department, I spent a lot of time with the employability people over in our library. But I think it's a struggle and a challenge to continuously kind of push back against that and try and insert our own, you know, subversive ideas. For me, it's about finding cracks in the structures of universities, working that, and it's really importantly finding colleagues, finding like-minded colleagues, finding kind of managers who are kind of supportive, and also linking up with students to create these networks of support that I think allow these alternatives to grow.
Yeah, I, you know, kind of for me, just on that, I think it's excellent that you've kind of broached the issue of employability, because it's often something which is incredibly, you know, it permeates all universities to various degrees, and you know, so therefore it has to be addressed, it has to be tackled and kind of incorporated into our kind of critical frameworks as well. So that's, you know, it's good. Okay, so I hope Martin is kind of happy with your response there. So the next question is has come from Alison James. So Alison asks, Anke, it has taken you 3 years to write your book, and the world has changed in that time. Speaking as someone who has been researching through the pandemic, which threw all of my original plans into the air, I welcome the idea of optimism in academia. Has yours been dented at all in the last 18 months?
That's a fantastic question. And Alison, I write about in the book. So I finished my head of departmentship. I had another term of teaching, and in January 2020, my sabbatical began, and I was all set to write this book. And then the world changed. Now, I kind of lost my writing support, right? I had planned to come into the office and to meet with colleagues and this and that. So it was kind of writing from home. that was difficult to adjust to. And then I did set up an online writing group, which was fantastic. But the other thing, Alison, was also that a lot of my teaching is in-person teaching. So a lot of the activities I write about kind of are based on students being in the classroom and manipulate materials and being able to interact and or learn outside. And all of a sudden, all of that disappeared overnight. And it was really, it was the first couple of months when I was supposed to really get into writing. It was really, really difficult. And I started to read all the different blog posts about, COVID and the thing on higher education. And I was, how much should I change the book? And especially talking about global challenges and not writing about COVID per se seemed really pointless, because here was, the global challenge for the time being. And because I'm not a public health person or kind of a medical person, I didn't feel like I had much to say to it. And I hadn't done, obviously any research on it. I got through it. Also because when I then came back to teaching last term and tried out a lot of these things online, I went back and changed some of my writing to also see how could some of these activities be implemented online or be done online. So no, it hasn't been dented. It had been really kind of challenged and called into question at times. But I got through it with the help of my family, with the help of incredibly supportive colleagues. I had emails back and forth with Philippa saying, oh my God, what should I do about this one? What does this all mean for my book? But I'm really glad I stuck to pretty much the original writing plan, because I mean, at least we here in Sussex are back pretty much to in-person teaching. And even though I know COVID and the implications of COVID and will be around for a long time, but I do believe that it hasn't fundamentally invalidated my project, so to say.
Brilliant, glad to hear it. Okay, thanks for that. The next question has just come up as anonymous, so I don't know who this is, but it's a good question, so I shall ask it. So they've asked if I can ask you how your research at Stanford's Institute of Design could be used or is used at Sussex, and could be adapted to universities in the Global South in partnership with students and staff in the universities in the Global North.
Yes, I have an inkling. I think I know where this question is coming from. It's a great question. And maybe just for context, I did do my PhD at UC Berkeley in anthropology. And while I was there for 10 years, I co-founded upon graduating, co-founded a research institute with Paul Braund in Silicon Valley. And we were kind of looking at how design and anthropology can come together to address global challenges. And the time at Rios and kind of the activities we did at Rios have really informed my teaching. And it was at that time that the so-called D School at Stanford University just got off the ground. Now, for those of you who don't know anything about it, just really quickly, the D School is an incredibly exciting and creative place within Stanford, where students from all different programs at Stanford apply and can come together, learn about design methodologies and design practices, and then take that back into their disciplines. It has its problems, which I'm not going to go into here. It was established with $1 million donation from Hasso Plattner, one of the SAP co-founders. Stanford, of course, being an incredibly wealthy university that was able to provide a building. I did go back and visit Stanford while I was writing this book, and I find the school really, really inspirational in terms of the space, in terms of some of their materials, in terms of what they kind of provide their students. But actually, having been at Stanford really made me aware of the importance of considering resources. And I talk about in the design chapter, the politics, the resource politics. And Stanford is an exceptional space. And for example, here at Sussex, we have a very small design department. And to my knowledge, they don't even have a prototyping space, never mind their own building. They probably don't have the kind of budget for materials. Looking at when I was down in Bolivia and saw the teaching spaces there, that is miles away from what Stanford can offer. So I think we do need to consider kind of the politics and the implications of the availability of resources. And if anything, coming back to Alison's point, COVID has just exacerbated these problems, because at least here at Stanford, it's all, at Sussex, it's all about cost cutting at the moment. So budgets that we used to have access to run design workshops, they just don't exist anymore because there's no more money. Having said that, I think what Stanford is trying to do, and some of their learning materials and their approach, is something that I've certainly kind of taken into workshops at Sussex that, again, I've run together with Paul, where we've tried to, for example, get students to think about the Sustainable Development Goals and how they could take a more design-oriented approach to these goals. So I see a lot of potential there, while also being really aware of the kind of the material implications that a place like Stanford and the difference between Stanford and Sussex or University in La Paz kind of forces us to think about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, brilliant. Okay, the next question from Anne Light. Anne has put, really pleased to hear you reject the solutionism that is quite common in design areas. Wondering if you can say more about how that plays out in making transitions from current to more critical and creative forms of educating.
Yeah, thank you, Anne. So I said I kind of didn't really, I don't at all use the word solutions, because for me, often kind of, especially technical solutions can be part of the problem. This is not to say that we don't need to solve global challenges. I'm absolutely aware of there is a need for solutions. How we get there is, I think, for me, much more gradual. And also it relates back to this idea of students wanting to save the world, right? They maybe come in and they think, I'm going to learn about solutions to world poverty or world hunger or whatever it might be. And I say, no, we need to stop that. And it is about a much more gradual approach that asks about, I like the word responses, because being in a responsive mode, that means you have to ask questions. And for me, design is really good about challenging us as educators, but then also students, to see whether we are even asking the right questions, right? To get back right the way to the beginning and challenge our assumptions and challenge the very questions we are asking. And of course, then questions ask for responses. And these responses, as I said, they can be multiple, they can be partial. And I really like the work of Bruno Latour and his take on design as a very humble discipline. I know we can argue about this, and a lot of design practitioners probably wouldn't subscribe to this idea, but I do believe that in an iterative, in an experimental design approach that also forces students to build. Now, I know that design students, manipulate materials all the time. It's not that common in the social sciences. Mm-hmm. So I often bring in, of course, the sticky notes and the marker pens, but I also take in Play-Doh and pipe cleaners and blocks and Legos, and just getting students to work with their hands. And I'm not the only one who's saying this. I think Alice and James also wrote about it in their book. It opens up different parts of their brain. It engages their learning differently. And that's where I think the potentials of the use of design methodologies in the social sciences lie. I can't really speak so much to design education per se. I do know that a lot of design education, again, is focused on, linking students up with industries and stuff, and that there is a lot of kind of critical writing around this. But for me, a critical form of design, a kind of a socially aware form of design, has loads of potential in social science classrooms. And my students, they're often a bit skeptical at the beginning, but then they open up the Play-Doh and they said, oh my God, that smell, it reminds me of my childhood. And they start playing with their hands and doing funny things with pipe cleaners. And it does change the atmosphere in the room. And it does kind of open up learning in a way that I think is really promising and creative.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. That kind of I've not got an art or design background, but some of the kind of best ideas that I've ever gleaned, I actually sat in a kind of, it was like a Twitter conference with some colleagues who were teaching a graphic design class. So there were lots of kind of practitioners, and then students were able to ask graphic designers questions. And one of the students asked them, what's the kind of most important tool in your place of work? And one of them said, you could see the table that they were sat around, and they said, actually, it's this table, because this is the mechanism that enables us to come in and sit around and creatively explore ideas. And at that point, that got me thinking, in the social sciences and in education, that is something that we should, kind of find mechanisms to kind of utilize and develop much more. So I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah, can I quickly also say, I've had one student who was kind of a big part of the research, who had done a foundation year before coming to do her degree in international development in Sussex. And I had fascinating conversations with her about how she thinks her foundation year education helped her think differently about international development. And also one of the exercises in the activities I described in the design chapter is actually from a student from Sussex who went on to do a master's in, I think, social innovation design at Edinburgh. And I write about her kind of more design-focused experiences up there, which are super, super interesting. It's all around kind of thinking about future foods in really speculative and experimental ways.
Excellent. Yeah, I love it. Okay, next question from, I do know this person, which is usual. So Gordon Asher. So Gordon, so he says, thanks so much for the thought-provoking talk, Anke. How have you and others whose work that you've talked about found the kind of teaching and learning that you are talking about has engaged with the present pandemic contexts, specifically the shift to online and hybrid/high flex teaching and learning? Yeah,
I think I mentioned that a little bit before already, but it really challenged my writing process. And I was on sabbatical when the pandemic started, so I came back to teaching in the spring of 2021, when it was completely online, and that really challenged me to think which ones of my activities can I actually offer online. And I was able to do so for some of them, not for all of them. But so at Sussex, we use a lot of collaborative tools, like Padlet was really popular with the students, Google Jamboards, so really tools, and of course breakout rooms, so really tools where students could, in small groups together, kind of share their thoughts. Maybe I can give one quite concrete example, which actually worked, I thought, really, really well if I have time, in my class on urban futures, and we've actually just talked to the students about it today. I base a lot of my teaching in Brighton, because the Sussex campus is so close to Brighton, and all third-year students live in Brighton at the time. So I say, if we think about urban challenges and urban futures, why not kind of try and figure things out for Brighton? And I start off at the very beginning of the class by asking students to keep a Brighton diary for a week and become really aware of, kind of their daily journeys, their interactions. Where do they go shopping? Where do they go for entertainment? Where do they go for their sports activities? So become more aware of their lives as Brighton residents, and then to produce an artifact. And that can be a picture or a photo or a small video or a piece of creative writing. And in the first year, when it was in person, I asked students to bring this artifact into class. And yeah, it was so. Some students did it. And then during the online teaching, I said, well, wait a second, we are not in class. The students, can't do anything physically. So I set up a Padlet. And I also realized that I need to acknowledge that a lot of students aren't living in Brighton, and B, those students who are, their lives is completely differently. So I reframed the whole exercise around, what are you missing about your pre-COVID life in Brighton? How is your life different now? And so I invited students to remember, to reminisce, to mourn, And I asked them to upload it on the Padlet that I created, and every single student did. And I actually, and I think I should just mention this here, I actually have a companion website to the book, which is creativeuniversities.com. And there's a blog, and there's one blog post where I write about this Padlet, and the students gave me permission to share the Padlet. And it was absolutely amazing to see kind of the artifacts that students had created, but also their writing. And they really engaged with the opportunity to just talk about what they were missing. So that's, and this year, having just done it, I decided to stick with the Padlet, because I think for students, it's a smaller kind of, you know, has a barrier to entry. It's maybe less scary to post something on the Padlet, also because it's anonymous, rather than bringing something into the classroom. Actually, I gave them the option to do both. My inkling is there will be more on the Padlet than what we will be seeing in class on Friday. So yeah, so there are definite kind of possibilities that have opened up, and I do keep using Padlets and like Jamboards in my class, and I know all the colleagues that I've talked to have found some of these tools really helpful. The thing we haven't quite figured out is this hybrid teaching part in person. I don't know, about your experience. I find that incredibly difficult to have half the class on Zoom, half the class in person. That's really tricky. I haven't mastered that, and I don't think I will.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because Gordon uses the term high flex, which is only a term that I kind of became aware of literally a few weeks ago. And it was because a colleague was attempting to run a class using this kind of hybrid model. And I think she found it very challenging, to be honest. So I've got that to look forward to at some point. Well, thanks for that. I hope that's answered your question, Gordon. So they are the kind of participant questions up to this point. So I'm going to sneak in with one of my questions now. So this question might be a little bit like asking you to pick your favorite student, which it isn't. But what is your favorite part of the book? Is there a part or a chapter that you enjoyed writing the most? And if there is, why is it?
That's a good question. Let me say the most challenging one was the Ecologies chapter, because I didn't know anything about complexity and systems thinking. Okay. So I read and read and read and read, and wrapping my head around that. And for those of you who want an introduction, I found Fridtjof Capras and Donella Meadows' books as fantastic primers to get your head around systems thinking. I really enjoyed writing the design chapter, and that kind of just links up to a longer standing interest in the role of design and development. And again, the work that, I've done with Paul at the Rios Institute. And the introduction, actually, once I decided to frame it as an invitation, and the introduction is incredibly personal, actually, and I've never written such a personal piece of academic writing, because I talked about the courage it took to write this book, and to kind of put a lot of my thinking about teaching out there. And I say, we all teach, but very few of us actually write about teaching, often not because we don't want to, because we don't have the time for it. So that kind of felt quite liberating. And then the capstones, the very short conclusion. I have to say, I was running out of steam, so I kept the conclusion really short. And I said, I'm going to go out with a bang and really go quite speculative. There's a great book by David Staley, who is a historian in the US, who wrote a book on speculative universities, who I found really inspiring to think through some of these thought experiments. So I guess three chapters, but I enjoyed writing the whole book. It was a really, really pleasurable experience.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Because I think as you said, the final capstone section is really good, because it's nice and concise, and it just the metaphor of the capstone as well is, I think it works really well. And just coming back to that, because on the ecologies, that's the section that made me think of Murray Bookchin, because his work obviously it kind of crosses ecology and hope as well. The fundamental principle of hope. Right. So I've got one final question, which should take us within, we should just fit it into the hour. So what is your advice to colleagues that might be thinking of experimenting with some of your techniques, but find that they are confronted with either rigid bureaucracies or powerful organizational processes that might act as sort of obstacles in that sense? How can they try to navigate these?
Start small. Yeah, as I said, I think there's nothing wrong with baby steps. You don't need to change your learning outcomes. You don't need to change your whole course handbook. Just experiment. Think of one class. Think of a challenge that you're already teaching about, and then think of just one weekly seminar and say, how can I maybe do something a little bit differently? Where maybe before we had, we were discussing a number of readings. Maybe how can I take these theoretical learnings? What might be kind of a real world case study? And I could challenge students to think about how to apply their learning to, for example, think about how to make Brighton a more equitable city, or how to design a recycling cooperative. That's another exercise I write about. So definitely, start small and find like-minded people, kind of get the support, and be brave as well, because not all students will embrace that. And I definitely have to say there's always a group of students that really, really appreciate it. But I do lose some students. And I think that's the danger we have when we engage in non-standard form of teaching. I think the risks are worth taking, because I think at the end of the day, and when I do get my student evaluations, they're usually really positive. So again, that's kind of reinforcing that I am on the right track. So start small, kind of find allies, and don't be afraid of getting a bit of pushback, because I think that usually means that you're doing something right.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. Totally agree entirely with that. The kind of bravery element is essential. That's really helpful. Right, so that kind of brings us. I'll just check that. Oh, we have a final question. Okay, so Paul Brand asks, could you talk more about the guiding star and how it might be used by different groups, educators, practice, students, etc.?
I think we might be out of time, but the guiding star is really important, and that's kind of a visual representation of the critical creative pedagogy. Again, there is a short video on the website. There is an image of it in the book, and I'm actually at the moment developing as a kind of heuristic that people could use to see how critical creative they are in their own teaching. So the guiding star is a really good encapsulation of what the critical creative pedagogy is all about.
Okay, excellent. Many thanks, Anke, and thanks, colleagues, for all of those excellent questions. Now, I think are we handing back to Philippa for final comments?
Yes, just for me to say thank you so much for everyone for joining us today, and some really fantastic questions. Thank you so much to Craig for being a fantastic host. Thank you to Anke for publishing her book with us, and thank you for your very kind words about publishing with Bristol University Press. As someone who I remember first meeting you, and as someone who had a very traditional experience at university, I was partly so excited because I wanted to take your courses. It just sounded so fun. And just to let everyone know that details of how to order Anke's book with a 50% discount are still available there in the chat and will be sent to you after the events. And just to give a plug for our next Bristol University Press webinar, which is on 19th of October, is on COP26 and new strategies for climate action. And those details of that event will be sent to you as well afterwards. So thank you very much to Craig and Anke. Thank you to everyone for joining us, and goodbye.
Thank you.